Welcome back to Benny's Custom Works, proudly supported by Valvoline in Sparesbox. Don't forget Benny 5 on checkout. This week, an all-new project car. Yes, this is my own car. It's a 1982 MG Metro. I did allude to the fact that I did have an English car. This has actually been in storage for about 6 months, way longer than I had anticipated. Massive thanks to my mate Brett, who's been storing it for me in Victoria. One of the cool things about this is mechanically, it's basically a Mini. So it has a 1275 A series in it. This is actually an A+, and it also has, for anyone who's not familiar with the Mini platform, the transmission is actually in the sump. So the engine oil and the transmission oil are common, which means A, it's a good thing because your transmission gets new oil every time you service it. However, it's a bad thing because your transmission is constantly eating carbon and petrol and all sorts of things. So these things did have synchro problems back in the day. However, the newer stuff like the A+ transmissions seem to be much better. There's also all sorts of weird things going on with this car. However, the biggest or the most unique part of this, I feel, is the suspension. So this particular car has suspension called Hydrogas, which is, I guess, a development of the earlier Mini hydroelastic suspension, which this particular setup has a fluid-filled bag, but it's also pressurized by a nitrogen accumulator. There's 4 of those, there's 1 per corner, and this particular car has settled. Now, Brett spoke to the previous owner upon collecting the vehicle, and apparently he checked the system by putting a pin in the valve and releasing some fluid, and as a result of that, the car's actually sunk a fair way. Fortunately, you can buy a DIY pump, which I have right here, so we are going to pump the car up today. In Australia, you cannot buy the correct fluid. However, most of the internet and researching that I've done says you can just put coolant in it, so that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to put some Valvoline green coolant in it, and we're also going to do a bit of a service today. We've also got some new wheels for it. The typical Benny thing, we're going to service it before we do anything else with it. I haven't even put it up on the hoist yet. It's sitting here obviously, but I haven't lifted it up. So I do want to check under it. I do want to try and get a roadworthy for it this week so I can start the club rego process, because being that this thing will probably get driven once a month if I'm lucky, I don't want to fork out $1,000 for rego for it. I don't really know what we're going to do with it long term, but it was cool enough that I thought I'd jump on it. It was fairly cheap. It was another marketplace find. I was kind of looking, I've been looking around for ages for a Mini, and I just can't get a reasonably priced one. So I feel like this is the next best thing. Mechanically, it's still a Mini. It still smells like a Mini. It still sounds like a Mini when you start it. So if you shut your eyes, not while you're driving, you still get the full experience. So we're going to dive on in. The first thing I want to do is tackle the suspension, because you can't actually pump the suspension up with the car off the ground. So from what I've found mucking around with it already, I have kind of played with it a little bit. You need the actual weight of the vehicle on the suspension to be able to pump it up properly. So we're going to do that first. We're going to pump up the rear, get the rear at the correct level, because the rear circuit is actually common between both bags. However, the front is independent. So we're going to start with the rear and then move to the front, level the whole thing out. And then we'll lift it up. We'll do brake fluid, fuel filter possibly. Also needs oil filter obviously, and coolant, because who knows how long ago it was serviced. The previous owner had it sitting for a little bit of time. Interestingly, I've got paperwork for this car all the way back to the UK days. So I've got previous MOTs. I've actually got the registration and ownership document from when it was in the UK. I've got a copy of the import approval. I don't have the genuine import approval. And I've also got previous registration papers from both New South Wales and Victoria. Interestingly, one of the previous owners of this vehicle was 5 kilometres away, which blows my mind, having never actually seen this car before. When I found it on Marketplace, finding that document saying that it used to be garage 5 kilometres from here, it's pretty mind-blowing. And it's also annoying that I had to go all the way to Melbourne, which is like 9 hours from here. So anyway, we're going to dive into the thing. There's been plenty of chats. There's going to be more chats. We're going to find some cool stuff. Now apparently, we want about a 320mm measurement from the centre of the wheel to the guard. So I've got 310 there. I don't hate the ride height, because you can actually set the ride height with this, but the more fluid you have in it, the harder the spring rate's also going to be. So it's probably going to be a little bit of finessing, but the factory measurement apparently is about between 315 to 320 millimeters, according to the guys on the MG Metro Facebook page, who have actually been really helpful. Shout out to those guys, the few people that may see this video. But yeah, unfortunately, the workshop manual that came with this vehicle mentions the specified ride height in the documentation and the maintenance of the system. However, I can't seem to find the specification in the actual manual. So it refers to a specified height, but doesn't actually tell you what it is. So a bit of a strange setup, but it is what it is, I guess. I've got our rear height pretty much where I want it to be. According to the guys on the internet also, it may actually pump up a little bit after you drive it. So I've set it to 300 mil on the rear. I'm gonna set it to the same on the front. I've just topped the tray up. I've added some more coolant to it because what I'm actually doing is pump this corner up and then I'll drain it, which will flush the system out. I'll probably do that 2 or 3 times until the coolant mixture that comes out is actually pretty green, because no doubt it'll probably be pretty rusty. I did muck around with the rear the other day, just sort of testing the system, and the first lot that came out looked like real brown muddy water. So I do want to flush it properly and make sure it does have clean fluid through it, because it'll make sure the system works better for a long time to come. Yarp. Straight in the shoe. Oh, man, it's my favourite. Do love a good coolant in the shoe. It's called a dash pot. There's oil in there. It's like a damper. So there's actually like a secondary slide in that carby that's vacuum operated. That's kind of like a metering setup. There's actually a needle on the bottom of that which changes the size of the jet. So the taper on the needle is basically the tune of the carby. So tuning an SU, this particular one's called a HIF or a HIF 44. So this is a later style of SU carby where the float ball is actually under it instead of off to the side. Pretty common. So this is an equivalent of a 1 3/4 inch SU. So 44, the HIF 44, the 44 is 44 millimeters. So it's basically the metric version of a 1 3/4 inch SU. But it's a interesting carby setup, kind of similar to a Strongberg. I think they're called a CD. So yeah, but not something really commonly seen, especially these days. These older SU carbs, especially the HIF 44, is not. I don't think anything ever came Australian delivered with that car. Possibly maybe a Range Rover here and there, but yeah, predominantly the SUs we got in Australia were the side float ball setups that were common to Minis and Jaguars, and there was a Hitachi version of the SU as well, used on a lot of Datsuns in the 70s. So not an uncommon sight probably 25 years ago, but these days, yeah, they're a bit hard to come by. That cylinder's black. It's a bit rich on that pot. It's probably got a foul plug in that cylinder because one of them was a bit funky. Like when you rev it, there'd be a bit of a miss. Click. We hit a little bit of a roadblock, bleeding the right-hand rear drum brake assembly. It just basically, there wasn't a lot of fluid coming out of it, and then when we finally did get fluid coming out of it, there was absolutely no brake actuation at all. So I quickly ripped it apart, pulled the shoes out. Unfortunately, we didn't get a lot of it, shots of it apart because Gian was actually in the car. But I basically disassembled the wheel cylinder. Both the pistons were actually frozen solid into that, which is strange because the wheel cylinder itself doesn't look very old. So yeah, it's obviously got some corrosion in there, and the pistons have seized inside that wheel cylinder. So after sort of getting them free, we pushed them out using the hydraulic pressure of the brake system, got that out, and actually basically honed the inside of it using a small cylinder hone. Got that nice and clean to a point where the bore is not corroded, and luckily it wasn't actually pitted. So it's a little bit of a strange sort of setup in what's actually happened with this. But yeah, it's definitely savable. I've also cleaned the corrosion off of the pistons. And I like to give the pistons a good wipe of rubber grease the whole way along the internal component that's inside the dust boot, because then basically there's no way that it will corrode into the wheel cylinder going forward. So good little tip if you are doing wheel cylinder cars to yeah, lubricate the full length of the piston using some rubber grease to stop it corroding to the bore of the wheel cylinder. Now we're going to put it together, bleed the fronts, then we're going to spill coolant everywhere, put oil in it, high five and go home. Oh, and we're going to put the new wheels on it, which no one knows about yet. How's your coolant sock going? So good. How's your coolant sock going? Don't have Oh, wait till the end of the day. The day is young, my friend. Coolant socks for all. I wonder why the car's covered in coolant. I wonder if that was the juzz that old mate let out everywhere. Now that the fun's all done, we can spill coolant everywhere. And the Metro doesn't even have a tap to drain the radiator. You've literally just got to pull the bottom hose off and spill it everywhere. So good. Good on you, British Leyland. I don't really understand where that's drawing air from. Like, it's just a duct to nowhere. What are you doing, MG? What are you playing at? Oh, maybe my coolant socks will get filled up again. Well, it doesn't look like the worst coolant. Actually surprised at how good that coolant is. Clip her up. The new wheels. Well, that's another episode in the bag. We've spent a bit of time today on the Metro, fixed a heap of little fiddly things that have gone wrong with it. The biggest issue being that right-hand rear wheel cylinder was actually completely seized and non-operational at all. Also, obviously done a bit of a service, changed the plugs, played around with the hydrogas suspension because it was literally slammed. Looking at it now after it's been up and down and the suspension cycled a few times on the hoist, I may actually drop it a little bit because it looks like it is a little bit too high. However, once it's actually on the road and running, I'll probably look at fine tuning it then because there's no point kind of doing that until it's driven enough that the suspension's cycled a fair bit. So yeah, pretty happy with how it's turned out. The SSR mesh, I think, really set the car off. It's a period wheel. I deliberately haven't restored them because the rest of the car's original. And I feel like if they were restored, it'd kind of look a little bit strange. Having the weathered wheels on a weathered car, I think, suits really well. So yeah, it's tied together. Next episode, hopefully this thing will be registered. I'm not sure what we're going to do with it yet. We may even take it to Cars and Coffee, but that pretty much knocks us out. Do want to also say again a massive thanks to Brett for holding on to the car and storing it for me much longer than we'd originally anticipated. So yeah, really appreciate it. Thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you next time.